Greetings, everyone. This is the last presentation in my History 1301 course. This is the Civil War, History 1301, the Civil War, 1848 to 1865. But this is the Civil War specifically, and it's part 3. Your readings are chapter 31 through 36, but again, as I've mentioned before, it just depends on what textbook you happen to have. Just use your common sense. If it talks about the Civil War, then those are the chapters you need to read all the way up to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. When you get done with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, stop right there and consider yourself, done. That's it. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go into a lead-in slide, the second lead-in slide, and I'll talk about what we're going to talk about in this last presentation. We've discussed Antietam, Emancipation Proclamation, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and the care of the wounded, medical care during the Civil War in part 2. Pardon me, we're going to talk now about Gettysburg. That'll take us a little while to get through. Then we'll talk about draft riots. I will have a little bit to say about Vicksburg, and then draft riots in New York especially, but there were draft riots everywhere. Then I'll talk about colored troops during the war. A little bit about the legacy of the war, and then the final chapter, that is to say, Sherman's March to the Sea. It's not on here, but it'll be on a subsequent slide. Sherman's March to the Sea, the wilderness to Petersburg, to Appomattox Courthouse campaign, and then Lincoln's assassination. So those are the major topics that we'll be talking about in the next, hour and a half or so. So get yourself your favorite beverage and pop a little bit of popcorn, and let's get on with it. Let's talk about Gettysburg. Gettysburg, first through the 3rd of July, 1863. Gettysburg is the largest battle that is ever fought in North America. It is still that way. Gettysburg is the biggest battle ever fought in North America. So let's talk very briefly, and then I'll go through, in the next 2 slides, I'll go through a series of map exercises, and we'll take a look at exactly what took place during the battle. So the overview goes like this. The Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee, again, they're victorious. They've been beating the North the whole time. They've just been beating them and beating them and beating them. Robert E. Lee realizes once again he's got to try to take the pressure off of Virginia, take the war to the North. This defensive strategy that the South began with had worked in large measure, but Robert E. Lee understood that the situation was getting very, very difficult for the South. So he scrapes everything together that he can. He gets everybody that he can get together. He calls in troops from all over the South, and he's heading north with 75,000 men. Now this will be the largest force he has ever commanded. Got about 120 guns versus the Union Army, and that's George Gordon Meade. Now, again, I know we've done this like many, many times, but let's go through our list of generals. We start out with Winfield Scott. He retired. As General Chief, will be replaced later on by Henry Halleck, who's only an administrative general, okay? But in terms of like the generals who are going to control the Army of the Potomac, the main Union Army, it's going to be Irving McDowell, and he got beat at the first Battle of Bull Run. Then we'll have George McClellan. He got beat in the Peninsula. Then we'll have John Pope, and he got beat at second Battle of Bull Run. Then we go back to McClellan again, and he did not win at Antietam. The battle was a draw, and he had all these advantages. So he then turns things over to Burnside, and Burnside got beat very badly at Fredericksburg. Then it turns over to Joseph Hooker, and he got beat really, really, really badly at Chancellorsville. So George Gordon Meade, it turns out he was actually writing a letter to his wife telling her that it's not possible for him to get picked as the next commander. He said he didn't want the job, had no advocates in Washington, D.C., he had no advocates in the Army that was going to push his name. And he was writing that letter when there was like a knock on the door. He was actually sitting in a tent, so I don't know how you knock on a tent. Anyway, they stepped in and said, Hooker's been relieved, and so you got it. But by that time, Robert E. Lee has already begun his march into the North. And so George Gordon Meade takes over. He's got 83,000 men. But please understand, you guys, that the Union Army has had a lot of casualties, a lot of casualties. So the numbers here do not tell the full story. In other words, many of these men, many of the 83,000 that you see, are not they're not the core of the Army. The heart has already been shot out of the Union Army, and all these are like really unsuccessful campaigns. And so you've got a lot of guys that are veterans, but they're all shot to pieces and they're exhausted. And then you've got a whole lot of these guys that are like brand new to the Army. They're recruits, they're they're draftees, and their training is iffy on their best day, and they're fresh to the Army, and they don't know how to fight really. So when we talk about the Union Army, it's a mixed bag on its very best day. By comparison, the Confederate Army they're veterans. They've been fighting really hard. They're enthusiastic, and these guys are tough as nails. All the cowards, all the shirkers, they have long since gone, and so Robert E. Lee's got 75,000 men who are tough. And George Gordon Meade's got 83,000 men, surely higher numbers by far, obviously, but it's difficult to say that they were of the best quality. Analysis: Lee got to relieve pressure on the South by taking the war north. I mentioned that. There's also still a faint hope of recognition. If Robert E. Lee can get well into the north and then beat the Union Army as he's defeated them on many occasions before, then there's a chance that he can compel Lincoln to sue for peace. That he can compel the North to give up. He can draw in some of these powers from Europe into the fight, and they can diplomatically get themselves involved and try to get a peace settlement done. Now, unbeknownst to Robert E. Lee, he had no reason to know this, but certainly Jefferson Davis, the president of the Southern Confederacy, probably knew that with the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln had made the war about slavery. His primary goals were still end the war quickly and preserve the Union. But the Emancipation Proclamation, which took effect on the 1st of January, 1863, had made the war, put the war on this more moral footing. It's about end slavery. And I cannot overemphasize this. In England especially, everybody is talking about the fact that they're not going to fight for a country that's trying to preserve slavery. So the people of England don't want to get involved in this at all. And they certainly don't really want to support the South, a South that's going to preserve slavery. The British worker did not want that. And British politicians certainly knew that. They were very cognizant of it, and many of them were talking about that a lot. Finally, the French would not act without the British. They have a really close relationship at this phase of their history with Great Britain, and the Emperor of France, Napoleon III, was not going to act without conforming very closely to what the British were up to. So when we talk about a faint hope of recognition, we're really hoping that, or the Confederacy was hoping for maybe Russia. Maybe the Russians would go for this sort of thing. Or maybe, some German state or something like that. Maybe the Italians would get involved and go ahead and do this recognition thing. And then others would follow. So when I say faint hope of recognition, I really mean that this is this is a long shot. Robert E. Lee is also very confident of victory, and they're hoping for that. Let's take a look at the casualties. And the casualties, I put it up here because the casualties they tell an important story just by the numbers. Confederate casualties, 28,000, of which 3,500 are killed in action. Union casualties, 23,000, of which about 3,200 were killed in action. And so when we talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, many historians even today will look at it through the filter of this Union victory. And that's unfortunate. To be clear, it was actually a lot closer than that. It was a very close thing. And the casualties tell the story there. The casualties were almost equal. The Confederates, who were on the aggressor side, they were on the attacking side during the 3 days of this battle, and their casualties were only slightly higher than Union casualties. So when we talk about Gettysburg, it is not a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination. It was going to be a very difficult victory for Robert E. Lee to achieve, but it was not impossible. And the casualties kind of indicate that it was really, really a close call. So Gettysburg, and that's the last phrase I have down there, the largest battle of the war, a clear Union victory. The South will never again invade the North. There will be raids that go up into the North a couple of times, but there's never going to be a full-scale invasion again. And so after Gettysburg, July 1863, the South is kind of on the run. Now, don't get confused by what I'm about to say. Vicksburg is happening, the Battle of Vicksburg, all the way out in the Mississippi, is happening at the same time. So we have two great big giant battles, two huge campaigns happening in different parts of America at the same time. And it just goes to show that this, the Civil War was like this huge war for America. There are more casualties in the Civil War than there were in World War II, to give you an idea. There's more casualties in the Civil War, which lasted, the fighting only went on for about 4 years. And it's bigger than Vietnam. It's bigger than the casualties that we have in all the battles and all the wars we're fighting today. Bigger than World War I, bigger than World War II. So the Civil War was what Shelby Foote called the crossroads of our nation. And he said it's a hell of a crossroads. And that's true. And Gettysburg is the biggest battle of that terrible, terrible conflict. So with that in mind, let's take a look at day one of the Battle of Gettysburg. We'll just go through this as a map exercise. So Gettysburg, day one, July 1st, 1863. Now, in contrast to Antietam, if you'll recall, in Antietam, by a stroke of luck, the North had gotten Robert E. Lee's plans. And so at Antietam, they had gotten intercepted. In other words, the Union had, under George McClellan, had intercepted Lee and caused him to fight at Sharpsburg, at the Battle of Antietam. But this time, obviously, the North did not get those plans. So Lee was able to cross over the Potomac River, cross the Rapidan, get up into the North, and start moving north. And he was not intercepted, and he was like, nothing was standing in his way. So he crosses out of Maryland and is heading up into Pennsylvania. And he keeps going north and going north and going north, and there's nothing to stop him. I mentioned this before, all the way back in part one, where the terrain was really on the side of the South. He's taking that same avenue that I described, going up the Shenandoah River Valley. He's basically undercover, and then he breaks out into the north, and he just keeps on going. So part of his army that was in the lead gets all the way up to near Harrisburg and near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They can see the smokestacks at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is deep into the heart of the industrialized North. But Lee senses that, the Union's going to start catching up with him, and he needs to get ready to pick some good ground and get set up and, get ready for a battle, get ready for a fight. So the story goes that he's talking to some of his generals, Longstreet, and he said, "Listen, I'm looking at the map, and we need to gather up. But I left my glasses over there. Can you tell me where all these roads lead into?" And Longstreet said, "Well, this is the town of Gettysburg." Now, Gettysburg was a tiny little. There was a seminary there, a religious college, and it was just this tiny little farming village. But as you can see from the map here, all the roads head that way. Now, a little bit of a sidebar here. There's this rumor that there were shoes in a factory or in storage there in Gettysburg. But Bruce Catton, who wrote about this just after World War II, he killed that rumor right off. He said, nope, a patrol had gone through Gettysburg days and days before. And if there had been shoes in Gettysburg, that patrol would have picked them up. They would have found out about that. So the only reason we're fighting at Gettysburg, ladies and gentlemen, is because all the roads happen to converge on that town. Now, on the first day of the battle, as it turns out, George Gordon Meade, his lead forces under a general named Buford and several of the other generals, John Reynolds, they were chasing the Confederate Army. And so Meade's army, the Army of the Potomac, is coming from the south and heading north. But Lee, ironically, his forces were way up in the north. And so he's having to like get them kind of turned around and head back down towards the south into the town of Gettysburg. So ironically, the southern forces are advancing from the north to the south. And all of this is kind of by accident. Meade had very poor cavalry. They were getting better, but they were still of low quality. And so the cavalry did not really pick up that Lee is like in the area or what he's doing or where he's at. The South usually had the very best cavalry, but their cavalry was being mishandled by Jeb Stuart, who was their commanding officer. The commanding officer of the Confederate cavalry was a guy named Stuart, Jeb Stuart. And Stuart was trying to ride in a big giant circle around the Union Army. Well, in doing that, he got out of contact with Lee, so Lee was kind of blind as well. So on an analytical basis, what we have here is what's called a meeting engagement. In other words, the South is approaching Gettysburg from the north. The Union Army, the Northern Army, is approaching Gettysburg from the south, and they just collided with one another. All the roads happen to be leading right to the town of Gettysburg, and they just ran into one another. And so day one is a meeting engagement. However, this is where the quality of the quality of the Southern troops, the quality of the Army of Virginia, Lee's army, this is where it really shows. Because they had this meeting engagement, they run into each other, and immediately the Confederate guys shake out into a line and they start fighting hard. And so day one is a clear Confederate victory, a clear Confederate victory. Union forces, which had been on the northern edge of the town of Gettysburg, are pushed through Gettysburg. They have a lot of casualties. They get beat pretty hard, and then they get pushed out of the town of Gettysburg. In other words, they don't control these crossroads. So that evening, the northern troops began to dig in. Now, it just so happened that they happened to be on kind of high ground, and that's going to be to their advantage on day 2 and day 3. So day 1 is a clear Confederate victory. Robert E. Lee is yelling at all of his men, get gathered up at Gettysburg, we're going to have a big fight here. The Union guys are yelling their heads off, show up at Gettysburg, that's where you need to go, because we've run into each other here. So the Union digs in on high ground, and they're getting ready to go, and they're concentrating. Now that leads us then to day 2 and then day 3 of Gettysburg. So let's go to the next map and give it a try. Now day 2. Now the map is a little bit confusing here because I'm using the same map for both days, and that's all right. Day 2, Lee is going to hit the Union Army at Culp's Hill. You can see it clearly marked on the map just outside of Gettysburg, Culp's Hill, C-U-L-P, Culp's Hill. Now again, this is high ground. The Union forces had dug in all night long. They chopped down a bunch of trees in such a way that the trees fell in the direction of the Southern Army. And that way, if the Southern guys are trying to go up this hill, they've also got to go through this tangle of trees. And this tangle of trees will hold them up, and then the Northern guys can shoot them. And so they attack and attack and attack and attack, and it fails and fails and fails and fails. So it's a very bloody fight. But the North hangs on at Culp's Hill. Similarly, at Little Round Top and Big Round Top, which is at the very bottom of the map that you see there, that is those two hills that you see in the lower right. That photograph there, that's the Little Round Top and the Big Round Top. That's how they appeared at about the time of the battle. And these are simply two kind of as you can see, these round sort of low hills, but they are critical because the South understands that if they can get control of that high ground, they could put a bunch of cannons up there and just blow the Union Army away. In other words, the whole rest of the Union Army would be within easy cannon range. So General Lee says to his subordinate commanders, Longstreet, and then another general named John Bell Hood, I want you to go out there and take Little Round Top and Big Round Top. The Union forces, similarly, a general named Warren, recognized that they really needed to hold on to that. And so Warren, General J.K. Warren, he sent messages all over the place saying, hey, get some reinforcements up here to Little Round Top and Big Round Top. And so Union reinforcements arrived on those areas just at the nick of time. And so there was heavy fighting in Little Round Top and Big Round Top all day long. So they fought at Culp's Hill, and day 2 is Culp's Hill and Little Round Top, Big Round Top all day long. In the middle, it's really, really relatively quiet. Again, Lee, this time, as you can see, his forces are kind of scattered out. He's got a whole bunch of guys there in the north, and then he goes around a sort of a J shape, an upside-down J shape. And so Lee's having a hard time coordinating the army because they're spread over, 4 or 5 miles of broken territory, a lot of woods. Hardly anybody actually has a map of the area, and it's really, really tough to coordinate. Whereas George Gordon Meade, as you can see, he's got this upside-down J shape, or kind of a backwards question mark, however it is you want to describe it. And so he's able to really control his guys. He's able to control the entire battlefield from a central location, and he's got a lot of men. So he kind of has this, he's kind of got this inside track, and that gives him a lot of advantage. So day 2 is, it's consequential, but it's a draw. Neither side wins. So heavy fighting at Culp's Hill and Little Round Top. The line holds, the Union line holds, but Confederate troops are confident. Now, day 3 is characterized by what's famously referred to as Pickett's Charge. One of General Lee's subordinate commanders is George Pickett. Now, George Pickett, flamboyant commander, very enthusiastic, very super confident. He's never really been in a big fight before, but he's really, really super confident. And he gets command, Robert E. Lee gives him command, George Pickett, of 13,000 men. And he says, what I want you to do is go right through the middle. And then, depending on how the battle shapes out, swing to the left or swing to the right. And encircle the forces that you run into and destroy them. So Meade is like standing fast. They're not even, nobody's really anticipating any battle that day. It was really, really, really hot, very, very humid day. Nobody was expecting a fight. But George Pickett gets these 13,000 men, gets them all lined up. There's a huge, gigantic bombardment. He gets a bunch of artillery lined up, and they shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot. Half the morning away, they shoot the Confederate artillery. And they're shelling that very middle, basically where it says, if you can see the phrase Cemetery Ridge, about where the phrase ridge is at, that is the middle where Pickett is going to try and break through. So where it says Cemetery Ridge, not Seminary Ridge, but Cemetery Ridge, right about the phrase where it says the phrase ridge, that is where Pickett is going to try and break through. So there's this artillery bombardment. It lasts for about an hour, hour and a half of steady, hard shooting. Now this is kind of unfortunate because it simply alerted the Union side as to where the attack was going to go in. So Meade and his subordinate commanders, especially a guy named Winfield Scott Hancock, pulled together a whole bunch of soldiers and reinforced the line. But then Pickett's charge goes in, 13,000 men, and they're heading straight towards a tiny little point in an effort to break through. Now that is that kind of painting that you see there in the upper right. This is Pickett's charge from the Union side. The Union gets up on high ground and they just start using their own artillery. They use, they use musket shots, and they just shoot at these Confederate guys as they're marching across an open field. And so by the time the Confederate guys get to this high ground on Cemetery Ridge, they're actually shot to pieces. And so there's no way that they can break through. So Pickett's charge will fail. Robert E. Lee was gambling that his men could bust through, and he lost that gamble. And so Lee recognized immediately, strong note here, Lee recognized that he had been beaten. He was defeated. So he pulls back all of his men. You know, they get as many wounded as they can off the battlefield, and they pull themselves together, and they head back towards Virginia. Now, once again, Lincoln is like, you know, he's getting telegraph messages, and he's getting messages about what's going on with the fight. Lincoln is all the way back in Washington, D.C., obviously. And then he realizes that Lee is moving back towards Virginia. I talked about the wounded and how that they had to be, you know, taken by a wagon. One report has the wagon train carrying just the wounded is 17 miles long for the Confederate. They have 17 miles worth of wagons carrying just their wounded guys. And they have to get all the way back to Virginia. They're on the run. So Lincoln is yelling at Meade through the telegraph, through messengers, Meade, go out there, don't let Lee get away. Find a place, get in front of him, and stop him, destroy him, destroy him, destroy him. But Meade is just too cautious. He's got a lot of casualties. Let that fact be clearly understood. They had 3 hard days of hard fighting. Furthermore, Meade knows full well that Lee is still extremely dangerous. And Lee is ready for a rematch, which was true. So what Meade is afraid of is that if he starts advancing upon Lee, General Lee will just find really good ground and get Meade to attack and therefore possibly reverse the victory. Meade doesn't want to lose a subsequent battle. So he holds up and he just pushes really hard, but it's kind of, you know, half-hearted, and he's not really pursuing Lee to the death, which is what Lincoln wants. Lincoln does not want Lee to get back into Virginia. So where Meade had what could be arguably have an opportunity, he let the opportunity go. And Lincoln, once again, is absolutely livid. But strong note here, it's not right that he should then relieve Meade in the presence of the fact that Meade has a tremendous victory, which he did. Gettysburg is an absolute, unambiguous victory for the North. And they had not had many of those. And Meade was the general in command. So here Lincoln has been waiting for generals to fail and then, you know, firing them and replacing them. Well, now he's got a general that actually has a victory. He can't very well fire Meade in the presence of this victory. But as we will see, he is going to appoint Grant over Meade, and I will talk about that later. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at what have I got going on here. Yeah, let me take a look at some pictures of the Gettysburg fight. Here are some very famous, iconic pictures, as it turns out, of Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg. Once again, starting in the upper left, that's usually where I start on these things. This is a very, very poignant, a very iconic picture of the Southern soldier. In other words, that's what a Southern soldier looked like in the Civil War. These guys happen to be prisoners of war. That's what POW stands for. They got captured kind of by surprise. But if you look carefully at this picture, and feel free to like Google it, and it will come right up, you can see the confidence that these men are still exuding. They are just, even though they are prisoners of war, they do not feel that they've been defeated at all. They're very confident, they're tough, they're wiry, and they are, you know, they're well equipped. They have everything they need to fight with. But it just so happens that the tactical situation allowed these men to get captured, but they do not feel like they've been beaten at all. And so that's why I included this photograph. These guys are ready to fight. Union dead in the wheat field, July 2nd, 1863. We know that because Matthew Brady wrote that on the back of the photograph. And you can just see, once again, how these fights are they're just heaps of dead. They just get caught in the open. These guys are obviously getting gathered up for burial, but they get caught in the open and they just get shot to pieces. The next photograph that you see over there, I actually wrote a paper that included this photograph and got a good grade on it, as it turns out. But this is an example of some of the things that can go wrong with photographic analysis back in those days. This is called, if you go to the Gettysburg Battlefield, that site is exactly as it is in this photograph. The rocks are still there. Everything is still there. But this poor, unfortunate dead guy, and he is a dead soldier, as it turns out, he was lying in another part of the battlefield. But Alexander Gardner got a hold of him and dragged him up there and put him in this place. So this is, the soldier is real, and he is truly a dead soldier, but the photograph itself is posed. In other words, the rifle, that's a prop. It's a real rifle, but it's a prop that Alexander Gardner was using. And then he laid this guy out there and then took the photograph. Which is why I have the photograph, the next one down there, called the slaughter pen. As it turns out, you can see that exact same soldier kind of in the foreground there. If you look carefully at it, and some of you don't want to do this, but if you look carefully, you'll see dead bodies all throughout this photograph. So if you can imagine trying to fight, you know, somebody trying to kill you, and you're in terrain like that, it's just horrible. And then you have Confederate dead in the Emmitsburg Road. This is the last day of the fight. And again, it's just, when we talk about the Civil War, you know, we look at this through the filter of the intervening 200 years almost. And, you know, there's nothing glorious about war, I guess is what that's the bottom line. People get killed, and, you know, it's just a murderous, murderous war. That's all there is to it. So with that in mind, let's just spend a few minutes on Vicksburg, which is happening at the same time as Gettysburg. So when we talk about Vicksburg, Vicksburg was a long, drawn-out campaign. Grant was trying to get control of the Mississippi River. He'd controlled the northern part of it, leading up into, I don't know, you know, leading all the way up into the Louisiana Purchase. That was under Union control. And the southern part of the Mississippi River was also under Union control. Navy forces had sailed up the river and had just blown away all the Confederate forces up to basically Grand Gulf. But then, for ships to navigate further north, they have to slow way, way down and navigate. As you can see, the Mississippi winds back and forth. Well, there's a real sharp bend in the river that you can see there at Vicksburg. And the eastern side is much, much higher than the western side of the river. And so up there on that bluff, the Confederates had put a whole bunch of great big giant cannons. And so there's no way to get past Vicksburg. Well, Lincoln wanted control of the entire Mississippi River. And so Henry Halleck, who's in charge by this time, he says to Grant, go out there and capture Vicksburg and get control of the Mississippi River. And Grant, who has, 100,000 men or so, says, okay, I'll give it a try. But the South is like really, really good. The general there's in charge out there is named Pemberton. And he's very, very, very good. And so he, like, every time Grant tries something, Pemberton trips him up. So the Confederates are dug in. But finally, Grant finds a way to get on the eastern side of the river. As you can see, there's a crossroads up there at Milliken Bend, and that was a battle. But then Grant cuts loose, and he marches all the way down there to Grand Gulf. He coordinates with the Navy. This worked perfectly. They get on the other side of the river, and Grant is on the attack. Now, what's important about this is Grant has learned a lesson, and I want you to really write this down. Grant, as you can see, it's one of the bullet points up there, crossed the river and lives off of the land. In other words, he has learned that there's enough food cows and pigs, whatever. There's enough food to actually sustain his entire army just by going through and living off the land, just like eat everything that is in his path. He reasons that those are Confederate pigs or Confederate cows or Confederate sheep or whatever it is out there, so just kill it and eat it, and that's how you're going to feed your army. Well, this gives him a lot of freedom of maneuver. And so there's a fight at Port Gibson. There's another one up at Raymond. Then he gets to Jackson. He beats Joe Johnston, who had been sent out there to help Pemberton, beats him. And then there is a siege. Grant goes right down the railroad tracks, and then there's a siege around Vicksburg. And that lasts for a long time. But Pemberton, very briefly here, Pemberton was actually from Connecticut. He was from the North. But when the war came along, he happened to be in the South, and he'd married a Southern woman, and so his loyalties were with the South. Pemberton and his forces get dug in at Vicksburg. There's a long, long siege. But Pemberton knew that the end was in sight. So he said, listen, I know I can get better terms on no other day than on the 4th of July. That's the best terms we're ever going to get if we have to surrender. So he told everybody, listen, we have to give up. We're out of food. We're out of ammunition. Our guys are like, we're done for. And so rather than just be stormed and defeated the hard way, we're just going to give up on July the 4th. So again, back in the East, at Gettysburg, July 1, 2, and 3, there had been huge fighting in Gettysburg. But here on July the 4th, Pemberton's going to give up, and Vicksburg falls to the Union. And so once again, Grant emerges as a supremely victorious commander. Now, the last bullet point I have up there, the population is very, very bitter. And as it turns out, that they're not going to celebrate the 4th of July until 1944. The people of Vicksburg will absolutely not celebrate the 4th of July until 1944, if you can imagine that. That's how angry and bitter and, just very negative the Southern population is about this whole thing. And that's going to have an effect later on. So you take 1302 and we start talking about Reconstruction, you're going to see why the South is they're so mad, they're so bitter in that immediate aftermath of the Civil War. So with that in mind, let's talk about, some of the personalities here, especially Lee and Grant. Now, all I really want you guys to do is just get control of your list once again. I have it all spelled out here. Now, each general on this list represents a Union loss. Winfield Scott retired, not necessarily a loss. Henry Halleck, he's strictly administrative. But again, Irving McDowell, he got beat at the first Battle of Bull Run. George McClellan, he got beat in the Peninsula. John Pope, he got beat at the second Battle of Bull Run. George McClellan again, he did not win at Antietam. Burnside, he got Ambrose Powell Burnside. He got beat badly at Fredericksburg. Then Joe Hooker got beat really badly at Chancellorsville. Then George Gordon Meade did not follow up his victory at Gettysburg, and Lincoln was just furious. But finally, Ulysses S. Grant will be promoted over Meade. Please write that down. Lincoln could not fire Meade because he just had this victory at Gettysburg, as I pointed out before. But he's going to take Ulysses S. Grant, and he's going to say, listen, I'm promoting you over the top of everybody. Grant will be in charge of all Union combat forces. His immediate supervisor is going to be Henry Halleck, but he's strictly administrative. Grant will be in charge of all Union combat forces, and he will generally stay with the Army of the Potomac. We will talk about that later. Grant was a killer. He knew what it was going to take to bring the war to a conclusion. General Robert E. Lee, that's a studio photograph of there, a very famous photograph of him. Here he is in the full regalia of this Southern aristocrat. Lee understands what's going to happen next. He knows that Grant is a steely-eyed killer. Grant was personally a nice person. He was, easy to get along with, friendly and outgoing. But Grant knew what it was going to take to win. And that was get control of the Union forces and just grind the South down. Just be relentless about it. And so that's what's going to happen. So with that in mind, I've talked about a couple of battles here at Gettysburg. We spent a lot of time on that. And Vicksburg, a few minutes. Let's talk about something else, and that's going to be the draft riots. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, the draft riots. I want you guys to put this under African American affairs. I mentioned before in my previous presentations, take everything that's associated with African American affairs and put it in one place. And that goes all the way back to before the war starts. Dred Scott, put that in African American affairs. Contrabands, put that in African American affairs. Emancipation Proclamation, African American affairs. Draft riots, put this under African American affairs. So strong notes on this, but be prepared to pull it out of your notes and put it in one place. In other words, I presented it to you in the context in which these events took place. But it just seems pretty likely that there might be an essay question on the final that talks about African American affairs during the Civil War. And be prepared to write an essay that traces all these African American affairs from start to finish. And draft riots are part of it, and you will see why in just a moment. Now, if you'll take a look at the dates, the draft riots are July 13th to July 16th, 1863. And so this is right after Gettysburg. So your first bullet point there, right after Gettysburg, Lincoln knows he's going to need more guys. The casualties at Gettysburg had been enormous, and so he says, listen, I need another 70,000 men. Strong note now, so you understand this. What Lincoln says is, I need another, vast number of men. 70,000 is usually what he called for. Sometimes 50,000, sometimes 100,000, whatever it was. But then the War Department, Henry Halleck, would divide that up among the states and would say, listen, your state has this population. You need to present this many guys. Lincoln called for this many troops, and your quota is so many. And so Illinois would get this, Indiana, Ohio, whatever. You're going to get this quota that you have to fill. Well, New York has the largest population of the northern states. Largely because of New York City, but New York as a state is heavily populated. Well, in New York, the governor of New York, his name was Seymour. The governor said, all right, well, we'll get some from, upstate New York, but most of the draftees are going to come from New York City because they have the highest concentration. Strong note here. This is like the third bullet point up there. The political figures who were in charge in New York City, Tammany Hall, it's a political machine. And it's the Democratic political machine. They control New York City. And the political machine in New York City that's controlling politics in New York City, they say, okay, well, we're going to stick it to the poor. We're going to stick it to the Irish. And they deliberately targeted the Irish districts of New York. It's called the 5-point region. It's right above the letter F on the map. That's called the 5-point region. And that part of New York was just basically a big Irish ghetto. And so the Irish know that they're being unfairly targeted for the draft. In other words, Governor Seymour and the political machine in New York, they're not going to target the rich, wealthy elite. They're not going to target the middle class. They're going to target the Irish, the poorest people that have like no political voice at all. So the Irish, they've been unfairly targeted this whole time. But now they're anger and their anxieties coalesce. Strong note here, and this is why this is about African American affairs. The Irish, and they kept saying this, they are afraid that if they go down to the South, beat the South, then all of these freed slaves will swarm up to New York and take their jobs. Kind of like some deal in South Park or something. They took our jobs, that sort of thing. Now, this is an unreasoning fear, but the Irish were convinced of it. The Irish throughout New York City had all the lowest jobs. They were the garbage collectors. The women worked as maids throughout New York. They were just servants. And so they had the lowest paying jobs in all of New York. And they're afraid that all these freed slaves will come up there and take their jobs. In other words, these freed slaves will be really, really desperate. and they'll work for even less and work harder and take the really crap jobs that the Irish were taking, and the Irish will be even further down the food chain. So they hit the streets. And again, the reason why this is African-American affairs is that the Irish will target African-Americans. And it's horrible. The whole thing is horrible, which is going to be the next couple of slides. And so they find African Americans and they just hunt them down and they lynch them and beat them and murder them in the streets. They found some African Americans out there in the dockyards and they just beat them and dump their bodies in the East River. And it's just horrible. Now, as you'll see in the next couple of slides, in fact, let me just go on to the next slide, but just take a look. It's going to be crushed by troops straight from the Gettysburg Battlefield. Somewhere between 100 and 1,000 are killed. But let me just go on to the next slide, and then I'll talk about this on the next slide. Okay, so the Provost Marshal, E.S. Sanford, he was in charge of New York City. And he sent a telegram to Edwin Stanton. And it says, the program is diversified by small mobs chasing isolated Negroes as hounds would chase a fox. In brief, the city of New York is tonight at the mercy of the mob. As far as I can learn, the firemen and military companies sympathize too closely with the draft resistance movement to be relied upon. In other words, the firemen and the military companies, the police, they were all Irish. This is part of those low-paying jobs that the Irish, took. So there's several things that I want you guys to get out of this. First is that the North is no haven. It is no utopia for freed slaves. Put this in the context of all these slaves that had been going north in the Underground Railroad. They've been trying to head north in the Underground Railroad all around the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and trying to go to the north. And we think in our mind's eye, in our American mythology, that it's going to be great for them when they get to the north. They won't be slaves anymore. No, the North was just as racist as they were in the South. So take a look at this, the large photograph that you see here on the right side of the slide. A symbol of this racism that was being exhibited in the North was the burning of an African-American orphanage. There's a picture of the orphanage in that actual orphan up there in the upper left. And they had clothing, and it was like catering towards them, and they got an education, and Christian organizations and the rich donated a lot of money. And so here are black children who are orphans, abandoned, and they're in this, this building. And while these draft riots are going on, the Irish, among others, are going to go to this building, loot it, catch it on fire and burn it to the ground. As it turns out, a lot of people are going to try and put the fires out and stop it. But then they get beaten and threatened with their own lives, and so the fire takes hold. And as you can see in this picture down there, ladies and gentlemen, these children, these orphans are trying to escape into the night. Take a close look at that picture, ladies and gentlemen. They're being beaten by the crowd, kicked and violently, just beat up and kicked around. While the only home that they know is being burned behind them. And so when you think of, that's why this is all about African American affairs. When you think, okay, well, the North is some utopia for these freed slaves, it is not. There was just as much hatred towards African Americans and much racism towards African Americans in the North as there was in the South. The illustration that you see over there, the cartoon that you see over there, is a cartoon by Thomas Nast. And there you see a black man being held up by two white guys. Now, as it turns out, these are abolitionists. The one guy with that kind of funny-looking beard on, the little chunky dude, that is Horace Greeley. And he was a newspaper editor, and he'd always advocated for the African Americans. The other one is another one of these advocates of the African American cause, and, they've been against slavery. But what are they saying? In other words, this cartoon is associated with the draft riots and the burning of this orphanage. Horace Greeley and the other abolitionists are telling the black people, listen, don't react badly to how African Americans are being treated during these draft riots. Let them get away with it. Don't, you know, uh, don't react negatively. Don't, here's this outrage that's taken place, but don't raise your hand about it. And on the left side of the picture there, you see the skull and crossbones. That's kind of the New York militia who had sided with the Irish. And the cops, they had sided with the Irish. And then kind of next to him, on the far left, that is one of these Irishmen. Now, Thomas Nash had a very negative view of the Irish. He was quite capable of being prejudiced himself. He was a German, as it turns out, and he was quite capable of being prejudiced. So you see him portraying the Irish as always these monkey people. But here they are with a bloody hand, having murdered all these African Americans. You see them in a heap there. And Horace Greeley and the other abolitionists are saying to the black man, just ignore this. Just let it go. Ugh. So it's horrible. The whole situation is horrible. Now, as I pointed out in the previous slide, somewhere between 100 and 1,000, probably closer to 1,000, were killed. Because Lincoln is going to say to Meade, listen, if you're not going to use the army, I'll use it. And he tells Meade, put a bunch of soldiers on trains and head them up to New York. Now imagine, if you will, ladies and gentlemen, a bunch of soldiers just straight off the battlefield. In the summer, it's hot. They're miserable. They've been in the field for weeks. And they get up to New York City, and here's all these Irishmen who don't want, they're living in relative comfort in their own homes, trashed out as they may be. But these soldiers are not really put up with any nonsense at all. They've been down there fighting hard. And so they're seeing this sort of rebellion in the background behind them, having been out there fighting the Confederates up at the front lines. And so these soldiers don't show much mercy. And they run into these rioters and they just shoot them. Drag up guns right into the streets of New York City and just shoot these rioters. So when I give you a range of possible casualties somewhere between 100 and 1,000, no one will ever know how many actually got killed. When Lincoln crushes this, Lincoln has this rebellion, this draft riot, he has it crushed. But the army isn't taking any prisoners here, and the Irish just get shot to pieces, and then the riots come to an end. Now, there were other draft resistance, especially in Chicago and a few places out in the West. There was some resistance, but the worst of the draft riots was absolutely, positively in New York. And again, I want you guys to put this into African American affairs. Now, with all that in mind, let's continue on with African American affairs with U.S. colored troops in the war. Now, I want to talk for a few minutes about U.S. colored troops. Lincoln finally sees the light. Abolitionists, especially Frederick Douglass, had been advocating for African soldiers to be fighting in the army. Lincoln had always been afraid, and many of the people in the army, the soldiers, not necessarily the soldiers, but the generals, Henry Halleck and Winfield Scott, and to some degree Ulysses S. Grant, had been saying, listen, we're not sure if these black people will make good soldiers. Now let's put that into context. Again, most of these generals and officers and politicians who are saying that are from the North. And many of them had never really seen any African Americans in any meaningful numbers in their lives. And when they had encountered African Americans, they were at the lowest jobs. And they were doing, the really crap jobs in the North. So first off, they're not seeing any African Americans. They don't know them. They don't understand that community because they just don't have any contact with them. Second, strong note here, the South, and especially in the 1840s, 1850s, had been generating a lot of propaganda about how African Americans are not really human beings. It was super, super racist. It was this white supremacist propaganda. Well, that's the only experience Northerners had had. So there was this doubt. And so Lincoln had held back and held back and held back. But finally, he's like, listen, I just got to have the men. We just have to have them. The Emancipation Proclamation had been all the way back and had taken effect in January. And everybody was okay with it. The North was more enthusiastic about abolishing slavery And so Lincoln says, I got to take a chance because I got to have the men. So he issued General Order 143 on the 22nd of May, 1863, and this authorized U.S. colored troops. Now, that's what they were called then. Today, it seems a little bit racist or insensitive, but I use the phrase that they used at the time. U.S. colored troops, that's what they were called. 165 regiment, 10 batteries of field artillery. Now, the field artillery, I do want you guys to write a note on this. Again, this is obviously African-American affairs. But field artillery, listen, ladies and gentlemen, you guys know that I was in the military for a long time, and I'm telling you this. This is the way it is. Artillerymen are not born, they are made. You have to make an artilleryman. Being in the artillery requires a huge amount of training. You got to be able to understand how the shooting goes, how to use, how to get the shell to land where you want it. This really super complex loading procedure that had to be done perfectly right. How to move this gun across the field, how to pick a firing position. Artillery has to be trained up. So we talk about 10 batteries of field artillery. It doesn't sound like much, but this is, well over, this is several thousand men. A battery of field artillery is several hundred guys. There are also various pioneer, and that is to say, engineering units, and that's how you build bridges, how you lay railroad tracks, how you do field fortifications. And so again, this takes a huge amount of training, back-breaking work, and a lot of training. And so the Army was really pleasantly surprised that these African Americans were enthusiastic, which is what the abolitionists have been saying this whole time. They'd been saying, listen, no one is better motivated to go out there and fight. You don't have to tell these African Americans why they're fighting. They know what this war is about. Now, it is unfortunate they're still led by white officers. And this will characterize our relationship with African-American soldiers right up until really the 20th century. You're not going to get the first African-American officer graduating out of West Point until just before World War I. It's just near, right at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Initially, they are paid less than white soldiers. Now, this was just Edwin Stanton really trying to get off on the cheap. He thought he could get away with this because the war was hideously expensive. He thought, well, maybe I can just get away with paying these guys less. But to their everlasting credit, the white officers protested, and many of them said, listen, I'll go without pay rather than have my men be maltreated in this way. And so pretty quickly, strong note now, Lincoln's going to find out that there's a pay differential between black soldiers who were paid less and white soldiers who were paid, the normal amount, which was not much, $10 a month. And Lincoln put a stop to it. He famously said, their blood is just as red as anybody else's, and so you're going to pay them the same. And so, the War Department, Edwin Stanton, Gideon Wells, all these other guys in the War Department, the Treasury, they were like, okay, we'll pay them the same. Now, during the Civil War, not less than 29 colored soldiers were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. In other words, these guys were tough fighters. They were enthusiastic about it. They exhibited courage and bravery, and they deserve all of the accolades, all of the rewards that being tough, honorable soldiers in the American Army deserve. One other thing I do want you guys to write down, if you take 1302 with me, you're going to need this later. There's an old joke out there that says U.S. Army stands for Uncle Sam ain't released me yet. And what I mean by that, and it's just sort of a joke, but it means that these soldiers, strong note now, with very few exceptions, these soldiers have to join the regular United States Army. In other words, they're not part of any state militia that was then activated by the state and then given over to the U.S. to fight the war. They have to join the United States regular army directly because many of them, almost all of them, with very few exceptions, are contrabands. They've been contrabands before. And now they have the opportunity to join the regular army and go fight the South, so that's what they do. But when the war was over with, ladies and gentlemen, they were still in the United States Army. And so many of them will be sent west to deal with the Native Americans. The 24th and 25th Infantry, they're going to be sent out west. The 10th Cavalry, I was actually in the 10th Cavalry for a while when I was in the Army, and they still carry on these traditions of being buffalo soldiers. And so that's kind of the last note that I want you guys to write. These soldiers are going to join the Army in huge numbers, as you can see, between 178 and 200,000 men. That's huge numbers. Those are huge numbers. And they're going to work in infantry, artillery, engineers. They're going to do they're going to do the hard work. They're going to do it. And then when the war is over with, you can see that Company E, 4th U.S. Colored Infantry. Fort Lincoln is in Nebraska. So they're all the way out there in the west. The other image that you see there is a recruiting poster. Don't be confused. Their overjackets for the Union Army was that kind of color gray, which was also kind of confusing on the battlefield. But that's derived from that photograph that you see at the very bottom. But the white officer is there, and you can see that in the illustrated image, they added a drummer boy, kind of badly done, but they added a drummer boy there. But again, I want you guys to understand what's going on here. There's going to be black soldiers, lots and lots of them, 178,000 to 200,000, but then led by white officers, who, as it turns out, were volunteers, and they became very, very proud of their units, because their soldiers would act like soldiers, conduct themselves like soldiers, and fight hard. All right, so with that in mind, the next slide, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on it. So minimal notes on the next slide, but I want to talk about, for just a second, the lasting legacy of the war. In many ways, the Civil War is still around us in our everyday life. So let's talk for a few minutes about the lasting legacy of the war. And I think you guys are going to find this surprising. So very briefly on this, again, minimal notes, but I just want you guys to understand, the war is more than just the fighting. Let's take a look at something as simple, as ordinary, as mundane as shoes. Now, before the war, when people went out and got shoes, they had to go down to a cobbler and have a shoe fitted and made, and that's how you got shoes. Shoes that were made in like large quantities, like go down to the shoe store and ask for a size 9 or whatever. That before the war, that really didn't exist. That was not a thing. But during the war, it was clear that they're going to have to put a lot of shoes on a whole lot of soldiers, because a lot of guys are going to do a lot of marching, which is exactly what happened. And they're kind of referred to as by the Irish phrase brogan. But here's the deal: before the war, any like factory-made shoes, any shoes that were made in any kind of quantity, were called straight-lasted. That meant that the shoe could fit on either foot. But during the Civil War, the War Department said, listen, we're going to need millions and millions of shoes, and they did. But we need to save a few blisters, because our soldiers are going to have to march all over the place. And so you're going to have to make shoes that are of a certain size, and you're going to have to make them shoes that will fit the right foot and shoes that will fit the left foot. And so after the Civil War, all shoes that are made in some sort of like a factory location, they're made for the left foot and they're made for the right foot, which had not been the case before the war. And so, a lasting legacy of the war, shoes that will actually fit your feet. How about that? Going kind of clockwise, let's go to standardized clothing. The story goes that the War Department understood, again, that they're going to have a whole lot of soldiers. If I can just speak English. They're going to have a lot of men. And those men are going to have uniforms. And so they need to make a whole bunch of them, like really, really fast. And the only way to do that is to harness the manufacturing capability of the North. So the Quartermaster Corps, that is the supply branch of the military. They lined up a regiment of guys, just an ordinary regiment, at random. And they lined these guys up, and they got out a bunch of tape measures. And the tape measure shows, there are this many guys that are kind of small. And then there's this many guys that fit within a certain, measurement range that we can, figure out they're mediums. And there's a small percentage of these guys that fit within a certain measurement range that we're going to figure are large. And so they knew that there was only a few that are going to be small, a whole bunch in the middle that are going to be medium, and a few that were going to be large. And so they told the manufacturers, make this many smalls, this many large, and this many mediums, and here is the measurement range for that. Make it look just like this. And so the jacket that you're seeing there is what's called a 4-button sack. It's a sack jacket. Very simple. Made at the Sky Call Arsenal in New York, and they made them by the millions. They made them by the millions. Because these soldiers are going to get these jackets, and they're just going to wear them out. So today, in the 21st century, you go down to, JCPenney or Old Navy or wherever you're going to get your clothing from, and how do you know which size is going to fit you? Well, because it's going to say right on there, small, medium, large, extra large, whatever. And that came from the Civil War. Standardized clothing. Let's go down one and talk about canned foods. Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, about 30 years, 40 years before the time frame we're talking about, Napoleon Bonaparte had set it as sort of a task. He'd had a reward out there for anybody that could come up with a way to can food so he could feed his armies better in the field. And the part that they kept on, getting it into some kind of container, that was not the problem. But the part that the French kept missing was you have to cook the food a little bit, get it up to 140 degrees at least, inside the can. You have to pasteurize it. And they did not know to do that. They didn't know that. Louis Pasteur was just then getting started in his scientific work. But by the time of the Civil War, canned goods, they had understood how to actually put stuff into a can, seal it all up, make the cans and make them robust, and then heat it up to at least 140 degrees, and then the food would keep. But that was really, really rare, and nobody really trusted it. But then along came the Civil War. Now, I challenge each and every one of you, the next time you're in the grocery store, go over to the canned foods aisle and look up Van Camp's pork and beans. You can see their advertisement right there. And ladies and gentlemen, look carefully at the label. I challenge you to do this. You've all eaten Van Camp's pork and beans. They're delicious. When you were a little kid, your mom probably gave you beanie weenies, and everybody had that. It's delicious. But it says right there on the label, serving families since 1863. Now, what on planet Earth do you think was going on in 1863 that somebody needed cooked beans in a tomato sauce with a little slab of pork thrown in there and then canned up? Well, obviously it's the Civil War. Eagle brand milk, that had been going on since just before the war. I think 1856, 1858, I think somewhere in there. But then somebody said, listen, we're going to need milk in the field to bake stuff or do whatever it is we need to do. And so if you remove a significant amount of the water, then you get concentrated milk. And Eagle brand, why is it called Eagle brand? Because of the war. Eagle brand came up with that. It's a Union symbol. And there it is, Borden Company, New York, New York, USA. And so they developed concentrated milk. And it's still with us. And Eagle brand still makes concentrated milk, evaporated milk. So what's important here? During the Civil War, people got used to having canned food. If you can food up, then you can have, peas and carrots in the winter when you can ordinarily never get that. You can have more or less fresh canned vegetables, green beans, or whatever it is, year-round. And this promoted very good health. Now, there was a problem, and it was unrecognized at the time. The problem was that to seal the can, obviously, you start out with a strip of metal, then you bend it around into a round cylinder shape. Then you got to put a bottom onto it and then a lid on the top. Well, to seal all those seams up, they used lead, and that turned out to be a bad idea. And people didn't recognize that for a long, long time. So if you have a diet of a whole lot of canned food, you're also going to get lead poisoning. Now, they will recognize that probably around the turn of the century, right around 1900 or so, and they'll stop using that and start using a lot more tin. But that was a problem. Under any circumstances, a lasting legacy of the Civil War, canned goods. Last but not least, paper money. Now, the Union soldiers especially had to get paid. They had to get paid. They insisted upon it. And the Army saw that having a whole bunch of coin out there was not logistically possible. We simply didn't have enough coin in circulation. And there wasn't enough coin to pay these guys in hard currency. So the Army said, listen, it's just so much more convenient for us to pay you in paper money. Now you can see at the bottom, the backside of all of these denominations was like really, really green. And green is actually a really hard color to make color fast. So it was hard to counterfeit. And so that's how they became called greenbacks. But as you can see, 1s, 10s, 5s, and that's how they're paying the soldiers. Well, it says on all these things, this is legal tender for all debts, public and private, which says on the dollar bill now. Just take a look at it the next time you have a dollar bill in your hand. And so the soldiers got used to having paper money. And vendors who were serving the military, they got used to being paid in paper money. And so everybody got away from using coin. So one of the lasting legacies of the Civil War, everybody had confidence in paper money. So it's just, when you think of the Civil War, don't think of it as some, event that took place a long time ago, and then has no consequence today. As it turns out, the Civil War is all around us. So with that in mind, let me give you a lead-in slide that will take us to the end of this presentation. So what we're going to talk about in the last few minutes here, probably half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever it's going to take me, is 1840 to 1865, the end of the war. We'll talk very briefly about Sherman's March to the Sea, and then the Appomattox Campaign, which will lead to the end, and then I'll have a few things to say about Lincoln's assassination. So your readings are the same. Whatever textbook you have, go to where it talks about the Civil War and go all the way to Lincoln's assassination, and that's where 1301 will end. So with that in mind, let's talk about Sherman's March to the Sea. So this is a campaign that's going to begin really in Tennessee, at a town in Tennessee called Chattanooga, but I'm not really going to talk about that. We're going to start talking about when Sherman gets control of this army. Now, Sherman has control of what's called the Army of the Cumberland. The Army of the Cumberland. And it's named after the Cumberland River. It had been under the control of several other generals during the war, Thomas and the Rock of Chickamauga and several of these other generals who really, they just were not dynamic. But Sherman now is very, very senior. He's a close personal friend of Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant, again, I've talked about this early on in this presentation. Grant is in control of all federal combat forces, all Union combat forces. And so Grant says, you know what, I'm going to put the guys that I know will fight, I'm going to put them in charge. And so he relieved all the other major senior generals in the Army of the Cumberland and put Sherman in charge of it. And he told Sherman, I got faith in you. I know you can do the job. Go out there and find this, go through the South and just burn everything in your path and destroy it all. Find any Confederate armies and wipe them out. And Sherman's like, yep, I know exactly what to do. So there'd been battle after battle after battle after battle, one after another after another after another, and Sherman had been winning and winning and winning and winning. Finally, in July 1864, he's able to surround Atlanta, Georgia. The Confederate general who happened to be in charge of Confederate forces at the time was by that time was a guy named John Bell Hood. And John Bell Hood attacks Sherman hard. It wrecked up the Confederate army that John Bell Hood had control of. And so John Bell Hood made some really bad decisions. And he said, you know what, to try and draw Sherman away from Atlanta, Georgia, I'm going to take my army, break away from Atlanta, and head back up into Tennessee. And I'll try and do, dangerous things up there. And maybe Sherman will chase me. Sherman, He was already determined and he knew what he was going to do. And he said, if John Bell Hood will go into Tennessee, I'll give him rations. I'll let him go. My business is with the South. So Sherman has a new concept of war. That's your first bullet point up there. With all that background in mind, we're talking about now Sherman's March to the Sea. And Sherman has a new concept of war. Now I say new, and it's inside those quotes. Because another military thinker, 25 years before, named Clausewitz, Karl Clausewitz. Clausewitz has said, yeah, there are really three elements to war as an event. There's the politicians, there's the military, and then there's the civilians. He called it a remarkable triangle. And he said, listen, these three elements of our society have to work together in order for there to be any war. The politicians have to agree with it, the military has to agree with it, and the people have to agree with it. So Sherman has this new concept of war. Again, Clausewitz had come up with it 25 years before, and we're reasonably sure that Sherman had read von Clausewitz's work on war. Here he's going to put this into practical application, which is your next bullet point. Sherman's concept of war is, if you make the war really, really difficult on the civil populace, then the civilian population will tell their political leaders, stop fighting, end the war. Please write that down. Sherman's concept. If you make war really difficult for the civilian populace, the civilian populace will tell their political leaders, end the war. And then the political leadership, especially in our democracy, but in any leadership, has no choice but to end the war. Now continue on with strong notes. This is an effort to end the war sooner. Make it really, really hard on the civilians. But please make strong note here. He's not saying go out there and murder the civilians. Just the opposite. Sherman understood, and Lincoln had told him this, that the people of the South are still citizens of the United States. So you can't simply go out there and murder those citizens. That is murder. Murder in the first degree. You can't. They're still citizens of the United States. That's Lincoln's position. So Sherman says, okay, I'm not going to murder the civilians out there. But if we see a cow out there, that's a Confederate cow, and we can shoot it. Milk it and then shoot it. If we see a pig, shoot it. Turn it into bacon. If we see chickens, that's a Confederate chicken. We're going to murder it, collect up all the eggs, and, put the chicken on the spit. If we see homes or houses, anything that we see, we're going to destroy it. Furthermore, he said, by doing that, we can live off of the land. In other words, he doesn't need a supply train leading from Atlanta, Georgia, all the way back to the north. A supply train that did that was going to be very vulnerable to Southern attack. So he says, we'll just live off the land. Take everything from the civilians and put their feet on the streets. Make the civilians pay a penalty for advocating a war, civil war. So with that in mind, let's take a look first at the map. July 1864, Sherman says, listen, we're going to march, we're moving, and we're going to head down towards Savannah, Georgia. He said we're going to make Georgia howl, H-O-W-L. That's a kind of a word that we don't use very often in English very often. And it means to make them scream. And sure enough, he says, just destroy everything in your path. He's got 150,000 men. He says, get spread out laterally, and everything that you see, destroy it. And John Bell Hood had taken most of the Confederate Army that he had control of, and he'd headed north. So there's no real resistance. So they're going to go down the railroad tracks, and they're going to tear up the railroad tracks, which is that picture to the lower left. And these are called Sherman's neckties. In other words, you take the wooden railroad sleepers, the railroad ties, stack them up. And then you put the railroad iron, the actual track, you've torn it up, but you put that over the top of the railroad ties. Then you light these wooden railroad ties on fire, and that will melt the railroad iron, and therefore you can't use it again. It can't be straightened out. It's wrecked. So Sherman is destroying everything in his path. The photograph next to this bonfire that's fixing to destroy all that railroad track that you see there. Take a look at that city. And that's part of Atlanta, Georgia. And it's just wrecked. That is an American city destroyed by Americans. Directly above it on the top edge of the slide, that is part of Savannah, Georgia. And it's destroyed. And so city after city after city is going to be burned. Atlanta was burned to the ground. Milledgeville, which was then the capital of Georgia, burned to the ground. Augusta, burned to the ground. Sherman got down to Savannah, Georgia. You can see it at the very bottom edge of the map there on December 22nd, 1864. And Sherman sent Lincoln a message saying, listen, here is a Christmas present. I present to you the city of Savannah, Georgia. Now, Savannah, Georgia, ladies and gentlemen, goes way, way back in our colonial history. It's a very important port city. And the people of Savannah, Georgia had gone to Sherman and said, please don't burn our city. And Sherman said, well, I'll think about it. And the only part of Savannah, Georgia today that goes back to our very important colonial history is a one city block square right in the middle of downtown Savannah, Georgia. Everything else burned to the ground. They started heading north, and they said, okay, South Carolina, that's where the war began. So however bad Georgia got it, South Carolina's going to get it worse. They burned Columbia, Georgia. That was then the capital of South Carolina. I'm sorry, Columbia, South Carolina. They burned it to the ground. That was the capital, and they pulled down the Capitol building. They went to Cheraw, burned it down in large measure. Orangeburg, burned it down. Went to Fayetteville, North Carolina, burned it down. Bentonville, burned it down. Goldsboro, burned it down. Finally, they got to Raleigh, North Carolina, the then capital of North Carolina. Was another battle up there, and they burned that to the ground. So it's just battle after battle after battle, but really it's just burning and burning and burning and destroying everything. Now the real result, strong note here, the real result, especially if you take 1302 with me, you're going to need this, is that the South hated the North. The South are going to hate the North. All their cities, all their railroad tracks, all their bridges, dams, manufacturing as it then existed, homes, livestock, it's just burned down. Everything is destroyed, destroyed, destroyed. And every bit of that has to be rebuilt. And the North is going to be very negative. They're going to be very reticent. They're going to be very reluctant to even help rebuild the South after the Civil War. So the South is just going to get just burned to the ground. And so many people in the South hate the North for a generation. So while that's going on, let's take a look at the main Union Army, which is going to be under Grant. And this is going to be a campaign that will lead to the end of the war. So we're nearly there, ladies and gentlemen. Hang in there. Take good notes. Now, what we're talking about here in the broad view is called the Appomattox Campaign. Now, this campaign is going to last a long, long time, all the way out till April 1865. So, we start out with Grant getting control of the Union Army. He trains them all up, gets them all pulled together. He has to go all the way around, way out into the west, get those guys into control. He goes down to the south, puts Sherman in charge, gets control of what's going on and around Tennessee, and then heads Sherman off into what we just saw, the Sherman's March to the Sea. Then, having done that, he goes up and talks to Lincoln. All this took a lot of time, and then he goes to content himself up with the Army of the Potomac. The main Union Army is called the Army of the Potomac. I've mentioned that several times before. And so Grant will, in large measure, stay close to the Army of the Potomac. Now, an example of that is in that photograph in the upper right. First, a sort of a sidebar. I mentioned before that ambulances were known. You recall that I talked about ambulances, and that generals would very often misuse them. Those wagons that you see in the background, that's what an ambulance looked like back in those days. Those are ambulances. But observe that they're right next to the headquarters. The guys that are all sitting around down there, that's all the headquarters guys. And so they're filled with baggage from these generals that are using these ambulances as their personal baggage wagon. Now, let's talk about the guys that are sitting there on these benches. They've taken over a church. I think this picture was taken near Spotsylvania Courthouse. But they've taken over a church, and they took all the pews out of the church and set them outside so they could talk and have their little conference. And the photographer has gotten up into the church, and he's shooting out the window down at these guys. Now, the fellow that you see on the left, leaning over one of these pews and pointing at the map, that is Grant. And Grant is talking to Meade. Meade is one of the officers sitting down on the bench. And the map is that little white thing, and it's kind of being held up by that ghostly figure there. That guy was moving around when the photograph was taken, and so he's kind of like blurred. But he's holding up the map, and these generals are conferring. And so you could just imagine Grant telling Meade, listen, this is where you're going to go, and this is what you're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. And all the rest of these guys are waiting around for orders. And so they're like, headquarters hangers-on and orderlies and, various guys just waiting around for instructions. So let's start this campaign. Grant is going to get control of the army, and they're going to get across the rivers finally, and they go to what's called the wilderness. You can see it there on the map and in that little verbiage block that I have there in the middle in the blue. And so they fight the Battle of the Wilderness. Now, the wilderness is the same identical location as Chancellorsville. But where Chancellorsville had been a tremendous victory for Lee, Wilderness is going to be a draw. But Grant, having gotten a real bloody nose there at Wilderness, they had a lot of casualties, Grant says, advance. And so they marched for about a day and a half, and they got to Spotsylvania Courthouse. And Lee had to back up and meet them at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And so they got to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Lee defeated Grant. Grant was beat at Spotsylvania. But Grant said, back up a half a step and advance and go to North Anna. And Lee had no choice but to go to North Anna as well. And Lee beat Grant again at North Anna. Grant said, that's fine. We're going to get more reinforcements. Go to Cold Harbor. Now, Cold Harbor, the old joke is Cold Harbor was neither cold nor a harbor. It happened to be a stop on the wagon train, the stagecoach route between Richmond and Washington, D.C. It's called cold because you can get hot food there. And it's called a harbor because you do have to get across a little river there. Cold Harbor was a horrible, horrible defeat for Grant. Grant got beat again. This time, really, really badly. It was a catastrophe. But Grant simply said, advance. Keep on going. So, ladies and gentlemen, what's happening here, and I want to be clear on this, Lee understood it. Lee is just being ground down. Where Grant is advancing and being defeated, he can make up those losses. The very next day, he gets that many reinforcements in. But every guy that is shot on Lee's army, the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Army, those guys are irreplaceable. They cannot be replaced. There are no more people in the South that can replace them. These are valuable soldiers, battle-hardened, courageous, hard-hitting, murderous soldiers. And when they get killed, you've lost a quality man. And so Lee cannot afford the losses. Grant is just grinding Lee down. Again, take a look at the numbers at the top of the slide. Grant's got twice the number of soldiers that Lee does. And Grant's just grinding Lee down. Now, Grant bypassed Richmond and hit Petersburg. The reason why, just very briefly, Petersburg is where all the railroads happen to come together. And then another spur track went up to Richmond. So Richmond was heavily fortified. There was lots of it was ready for a siege. And so Grant said, just forget it. Let's go down to their logistics center, Petersburg, where all the railroads are coming together, and we'll stop that. And if we can hold up the railroads, then the entire Southern railroad system would come to a halt, which is exactly what happened. Now, the last thing I want to talk about on the slide very quickly here is take a look at that picture on the lower right. Look at all those wagons. And this is just an example of the supply system that Grant had available to him. In that front rank there, you can see a whole bunch of ambulances, but then behind it, it's supply wagon after supply wagon after supply wagon after supply wagon. God knows how many there are. There has to be 200 or 300 supply wagons there. And think of all the men necessary to run that, and all the horses. If there's 200 or 300 wagons there, and there has to be, God knows there must be 1,000 horses in that picture. And then all the teamsters and all the guys running the wagons. So Grant is finally in a position, and Lincoln is in a position, to make the manufacturing strength of the North really pay off. So it's one battle after another, after another, after another, until there is a siege at Petersburg, which is the next slide, the next two slides. So Grant gets in and around Petersburg. You can see all the railroads are like heading into it. There's one that comes in from the east, a couple that come in from the south, and one that comes in from the west. And so Petersburg is this big giant kind of manufacturing and railroad hub. So it's really critical to the South that they hold on to this. And Grant knows that, and so does General Lee. So General Lee just starts putting in big giant siege lines. And that's that. I know it's kind of hard to make out, but where it says Petersburg and then that kind of explosion symbol, if you see that sort of squiggly line there, that is a siege line. In other words, heavy trenches. And many historians have talked about how this kind of presages, this predicts siege warfare in World War I, which is true. But Grant couldn't break through without enormous casualties. He tried it several times, and he couldn't break through and couldn't break through and couldn't break through. So the only thing he could do is continue to get more guys and extend farther and farther to our left as we're viewing the map. Extend farther and farther and farther to the west. And sooner or later, Lee will run out of men. And so this went on and went on and went on and kept on going and kept on going and kept on going until finally, to make a long story short, Grant is able to break through. So that's kind of what the verbiage says. Lee is trapped in Petersburg. He has to hold on to it because of the railroads. The Confederate Army, they're like stretched really, really thin, but they do have internal lines. In other words, their lines are very compact. And so Lee's going to use that to his advantage. Grant had tried an assault, and those had all failed. But he says, listen, here we are. I gotta like dial back the casualties because of the effect that it may have in November 1864 with the election. November 1864, Lincoln is reelected, especially due to the soldier vote. I do want you guys to make a strong note on that. This is the first time in American history that we have a large absentee ballot. And in the North, all the governors and all the political people said, listen, we've got to send absentee ballots out to the soldiers, wherever they are, and allow those guys to vote. So the governors would send, bales and bales of ballots out to their regiments, the Indiana regiments or the New York regiments or this, that, or the other. The soldiers would be given an opportunity to vote, and then those votes would be sent back to the states. And in an overwhelming majority, the soldiers all voted for Lincoln, and that put him over the top. I can't overemphasize that. Nobody, even Lincoln, did not feel that he was going to get reelected in November 1864. But everybody could see the end of the war. Plus, the South is not really voting in this election. And the soldiers all voted for Lincoln because they could see that he would actually carry the war through to the end. So Grant is then stuck, and that's the next bullet point. He's trying to probe and probe and probe, and they fail and fail and fail until finally, in April 1865, Lee is outflanked, and he has to run for it. In other words, they finally got Hancock over there, and you can see it all the way over there on the right. I'm sorry, all the way over on the left. And Hancock finally broke through, and they're able to do it. Him and Warren, it's unfortunate that Warren made a mistake on the battlefield and got fired. That's unfortunate. He had done really good at Gettysburg. And another general, Sheridan, and they do a good job out there, but they finally broke through. And so, General Lee has to run for it, April 1865. Let's go on to the next slide. So here we are. As you can see, there's no verbiage here, but this, I mean, the lines on the map tell the story. Sheridan and Hancock and all these other guys had broken through. Lee is outflanked. He sent a message up to Jefferson Davis saying, listen, it's done. We've got to make a run for it. Now, strong note here, Lee sent a message out to some of his subordinate commanders saying, listen, I got to have a supply train full of food and rations and ammunition waiting for me. And so get this supply train together and have it waiting for me out around Lynchburg or over by Appomattox. And his subordinate said, okay, we'll do that as fast as we can. And they got a bunch of food together and horses and ammunition and extra stuff, and they sent that train out there. Well, Robert E. Lee is running for it. He starts in Petersburg. You can see the lines there, those dark stretches, those dark marks there, those dark arrows. And he's going and going and going, and they turn and fight, and they turn and fight, and they go and go and go. Finally, they get near Appomattox, and Lee turns to fight. He's hoping to hold off the Union so he can go to the supply train and get resupplied, and they can fight again. They can see what happened next. Well, a message came through saying, listen, the supply train got captured by the Union and burned. And Lee got up on a small hill or whatever it was, and he looked to the north, and all he could see was Union soldiers marching right at him. He looked back to the east, the right on our slide here, and all he could see was thousands of Union soldiers marching right at him. He looked to the south. There was cavalry and artillery charging right at him. And he said, okay, that's it. We're surrounded. So on April 9th, 1865, Lee will surrender with the main Confederate Army. And that represents the end of the war. Please write that down. Lee surrenders with the main Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, on April 9th, 1865. It was a very poignant ceremony. Lee got dressed up in his best uniform. He sent a message through the line saying, listen, let's do this. Let's do this surrender thing. Grant got the message. The story goes, he had a really, really bad headache that day. Very bad headache. But he got a message from Lee saying, listen, we got to give up. Let's negotiate. And he said immediately, Grant said this later on, immediately the headache was suddenly gone. Just like that. Bam. And he didn't wait around to get into his best uniform. He just jumped on a horse and went running over to Appomattox Courthouse. And they met at Wilmer McLean's farmhouse. They talked it over for a little while, just had a pleasant conversation. And then Lee said, listen, let's go ahead and do this thing. And Grant was like, okay. And Grant wrote out a surrender saying, listen, we'll feed your guys. They can go back home. They can keep their rifles or whatever. If they have their own horses, they can keep their own horses. But that's it. That's all they can do. They can only go back home. And then Grant said, listen, do you need food for your guys? And Lee was like, yes, please. I got to have, my guys are starving. Lee said that would have the best effect upon my men. Now, Grant is writing out these surrender terms knowing that that's what Lincoln wanted. Grant and Lincoln had met a few weeks before, and Lincoln had said, listen, if it comes to a surrender, be as generous as you can. So Grant did what Lincoln wanted. He's trying to like end the war and be friends. In other words, the Confederate Army, all the men that made up the Confederate Army, I can't overemphasize this, you guys, they're not from another country. They are Americans. And Grant took that very seriously, and so did Lincoln. So Grant's going to write out a surrender terms, and it's going to be very, very generous. Keep any weapons that are your own, just go home. Be good citizens. If you have a horse and the horse happens to belong to you, go home. Take your horse and go. And they fed the soldiers, those Confederate soldiers, and off they went home. And that was it. Now, to be clear, fighting went on for another few days until everybody in the South got the message that Lee had surrendered. Jefferson Davis is going to escape, and he'll be at large for a few more days. He finally got captured by a Union patrol. They treated Jefferson Davis very, very badly, chained him up in the dungeon of a prison in New York, and kept him there for, several weeks. But finally, they let him out. They let him go and just said, listen, just go away. Don't bother us anymore. As it turns out, the last battle of the Civil War was actually took place in Texas at a place called Palmetto Ranch, which is south of Galveston. And as it turns out, ironically, it was a Confederate victory. But word got around to everybody, even down here in Texas, that Lee had surrendered. And so April 9th, 1865 usually represents the end of the Civil War. Now, with all that in mind, let's take care of one last piece of business, and that's Abraham Lincoln's assassination. So Abraham Lincoln had been working 18-hour days for months and months and months. And he had one setback after another, and another setback and another setback after that, and things were going terrible. Early on in his presidency, he had a hard time getting his cabinet to work together. He had a hard time with all of them. One of his children had gotten sick and had died, Willie. One of his other sons had decided he's going to go off and join the army. And Lincoln did not want that. And so things were like really, and plus his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, she was a handful. To make a long story short, she was a very difficult person to get along with. But finally, after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln felt like he could relax a little bit. Oh, thank God the war's over, I can relax. And so he decided to take in a play, go to the theater and take in a play. Now, very briefly, the play is called Our American Cousin. And Ford's Theater, which is where all this took place, Ford Theater is still there. And every April 14th, they play Our American Cousin. And it is a comedy. It's the differences between English, British English, and American English. And how there can be kind of innocent misunderstandings between those two languages. So Lincoln and his wife, they're going to go to take in the play. Lincoln sent a message over to Andrew Johnson, the then vice president, said, listen, go to the play with me. And Andrew Johnson said, listen, I'm feeling under the weather. I'm a little bit sick. I'm not going to be able to come. Okay. Lincoln sent a message over to Edwin Stanton. Hey, go to the play with me. And Edwin Stanton said, you know what? It turns out I'm going up to New York to do a little bit of campaigning, take care of some political business. Okay, fine. He sent a note over to General Grant. General Grant happened to be in town, and General Grant's wife, Julia, her left eye was really badly crossed. In other words, her right eye would look forward, but her left eye was like really, it looked hard to the right. And she was really self-conscious about it. And so she said, we're not going to go. So Grant said, okay, we won't go. And what I'm trying to illustrate with this is how casual people felt about the office of the presidency. Today, whether you like the president or not, whoever the president may be, if you get an invitation from the White House, you're going to go. Out of courtesy, you're going to go and you're going to do, go take in a movie or play, they're going to get a bowling alley down there in the White House. You're going to go, shoot some pins. But back in those days, you could safely get away with, sorry, but I'm not going to hang out with you. So word got around that the president was going to go see this play, and word got to John Wilkes Booth, who was that individual in the lower right. Now, John Wilkes Booth was an actor, and it turns out he was a very good actor and a very famous actor. Imagine this event taking place, and if today it would be, I don't know, it'd be Tom Hanks or somebody like that. And so when we talk about John Wilkes Booth, understand he was a very well-respected Shakespearean actor. He was also from Virginia. He had been in the Confederate Army early on in the war, but being in the Army and being an actor, that did not work out really well. So he's a deserter from the Confederate Army. Well, he was in town and he picked up his mail at Ford's Theater. That was his mailing address. You could do that back in those days. And so he heard that Lincoln was going to go to the play that night. And he said, okay, now's my chance. Now, John Wilkes Booth, I want to be clear, this is a conspiracy, and it's a long-running conspiracy. John Wilkes Booth wanted to kill Lincoln. They'd actually tried to kidnap him and kill him earlier on during the war and missed their chance. They talked about this a lot, him and his conspirators. And so, but now he says, okay, I got a chance to do it. So he tells one of the guys, George Atzerodt, whose photograph is up there in the middle of the upper part of the slide there. He says, listen, you got to go kill the vice president. Now, George Atzerodt, a German immigrant, most accounts have him as being of low intelligence. I don't know how to put that without being politically incorrect, but he was a low wattage light bulb, ladies and gentlemen. Another one, John Surratt, Michael O'Laughlin, Lewis Powell, also known as Payne. And these were individuals who were easily influenced, let's put it that way. Anyway, John Wilkes Booth went to them and said, listen, you go kill the vice president. You go kill that guy. You go kill the other guy. You go do this. You go do that. Lewis Powell was stumbling down the streets drunk, saying, listen, he had a gun in one hand and a bottle in the other, saying, listen, I got to go kill Edwin Stanton. Where's he at? I got to go kill this guy. And they arrested him. George Atzerodt, he just chickened out and didn't do it. But the story goes that John Wilkes Booth, he was going to carry out his part fine. Now, back in those days, the president had to pay for his own security detail. Today, the Treasury Department pays for that, but at that time, Lincoln had to pay for that himself. And so he had a security guard with him, paid him out of his own pocket. Lincoln was a very generous man. He's making better money as the president than he'd ever made in his life. But the security guy, before they went to the play, had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 beers at a saloon. And so, as all of you know, when you have 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 beers, after a while you got to go to the bathroom. So Lincoln got in there. He got seated. He's there with his military secretary, and the military secretary couldn't say no to Lincoln. So he had to go. There he is with Mary Todd, and they're watching the play. Well, the security guard got up and went to go to the bathroom. And John Wilkes Booth saw his chance. So he went up the back stairs and shot Lincoln right from behind. And the bullet went in the left side of Lincoln's skull and went across the bottom of the brain pan and lodged behind his right eye. It was a small caliber bullet, but that wound was fatal. The story goes that he did not die immediately, and as it turns out, very remarkably, just a couple of years ago, somebody was going through some records and actually found the attending doctor's notes. They'd been lost this whole time. Nobody even knew they existed. And they'd been misfiled in an archives, and somebody turned them up and said, well, this has got to be fake. But it turned out that it was the attending surgeon's notes on Lincoln on the night of the murder. Well, the attending surgeon he looked at the wound, and said, listen, Lincoln's not going to make it. In other words, they took Lincoln out of Ford's Theater, took him across the street. That building is still there. It's a sort of an apartment building, and laid him down in the bed. Edwin Stanton showed up. Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, he showed up. And this doctor showed up, and he said, listen, Lincoln's not going to make it. And so while he was shot on the 14th, he actually died early on the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning or so, on the 15th. John Wilkes Booth, we'll follow his story for just a moment. He jumped out of the platform there, the box. He landed hard and broke one of the bones in his lower leg. He yelled, "Sic semper tyrannis." I have it spelled there for you. It means, "Thus be it always to tyrants." And that is the motto of Virginia. Sic semper tyrannis. Thus be it always to tyrants. John Wilkes Booth got on a horse and rode off. And that leads to the map at the upper right. He left Ford's Theater, went down to, he's traveling kind of south. He found a doctor's office out there, a country doctor named Samuel Mudd. Knocked on the door, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, whatever it was, and he said, listen, I got a busted leg, a horse kicked me or whatever it was he said, and Samuel Mudd set his leg. They were going to hang Samuel Mudd for that. But Samuel Mudd said, listen, I didn't have any idea. I didn't know this. Anyway, got into a boat, and to make a long story short, he hid out in a tobacco barn. You can see it there, Garrett's Farm. And he hid out in a tobacco barn for a couple of days, and a Union patrol came by. Well, they found him in there, and he's in this tobacco barn. And they yelled in, and he yelled out something. Nobody knows what he said. But they finally said, listen, if you don't come out, we're going to throw a torch into this tobacco barn, and it will burn. And so he's coming out. John Wilkes Booth is coming out of the tobacco barn, and a Union corporal shot him. Now, there are two stories. One says that he got shot in the neck. I disagree with that. The other story is he got shot in the body because the bullet went through his body and broke his back from the inside. And I discount the story that he got shot in the neck because bullets back in those days were huge. We've already talked about this. And it was very, very close range. So if he'd have gotten hit in the neck with that bullet, it would have killed him instantly. It would have blown his head right off. Anyway, he's laying there in the dirt, and he said to somebody, listen, raise my hands up in front of my face. And they did. And he said, useless, useless. And he died. And that's the end of John Wilkes Booth. But I do want to spend a couple of minutes on, what happens to the other conspirators. They're rounded up, and they're given a military trial. Strong note now, this is almost certainly unconstitutional. There's no place in our Constitution where civilians in time of peace can be tried in a military court-martial under military law. That was unconstitutional. But this justice was exhibited that way for two reasons. Number one, it was going to be short. The trial was not going to take long, and it did not. Number two, everybody knew what the outcome was going to be. Everybody that got accused were going to be found guilty. And so, John Surratt, his mother Mary Surratt, who was almost certainly innocent, Lewis Powell, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Laughlin, along with, George Osterott, they're all going to get hanged. Which, as it turns out, is the next couple of slides. Now, if you're squeamish about this sort of thing, I caution you, these next two slides are going to be very, very brutal. So, sure enough, very briefly, they were found guilty in this military court-martial. And there they are in the old federal prison, which is Washington, D.C., and they built the scaffold that you can see there. They were marched out there, went up 13 steps. It's hard to make out, but if you'll take a look at the lower right side of the picture, what's leaning up against the wall is all the picks and shovels used to make the graves. So the graves were right there. right next to the picks and shovels. So they were marched right by their graves and taking up those 13 steps. And it was a hot day. The sun was out, and you can see, it's kind of hard to make out here, but Mary Surratt is on the far left of the scaffold as you're facing it. And somebody, and this is just the craziest thing, somebody had a parasol, an umbrella, and they opened up the umbrella to shade her from the sun. And so there she is, and they're putting the rope around her neck. And then somebody said, listen, when she falls, her dress might fly up and somebody might see something. Because you can see in the foreground, there's a whole bunch of witnesses. Well, so they didn't want that to happen. Poor Mary Surratt, she's in her late 40s by this time. And again, she's almost certainly innocent of any charges. But somebody had to run down the stairs, go back into the prison building, find a rope, run back out there, and tie her dress down so that nobody will, quote, see something. Then somebody else said, well, if we tie her down, we got to tie everybody else down. So again, they got to run down the stairs, go back into the building, get some more rope, and come back there and tie everybody else down. Understand, ladies and gentlemen, she's standing there in the flaming heat of the sun with a rope around her neck. Well, all this crazy stuff is going on. Anyway, finally, they got all that out of the way, and you can just barely make it out in the photograph. If you look directly under Mary Surratt, there's a guy standing there, and he's holding up a sort of a board. And there's another guy kind of like, on the other side from him, a very famous Union officer named Winfield Scott Hancock is going to clap his hands 3 times. And that was the signal to kick out the boards, and that leads us to the last slide. And that is Mary Surratt and George Atzerodt and Michael O'Laughlin, and they definitely got hanged. So with that, that concludes everything that I have to say about the Civil War. I have a couple of lead out slides, so let's proceed to that. So this is my lead out slide. This has been U.S. history. We started all the way back in, God knows, 1492 with Native Americans and the discovery of the New World by the Spanish. We went through colonial development. We went through the American War of Independence. We went through Jacksonian. We went through slavery on 2 occasions. And now, finally, the Civil War. Thank you all very much for your kind attention. I hope you enjoyed all this. If you're seeing this in an online setting, well, again, I hope you enjoyed it. If you're seeing this as an adjunct to the face-to-face class, well, there you have it. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I will see you guys when I see you. Good luck on the final.